Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for remaining with us for the final session of this two-day discussion on entrenched illiberalism in mainland Southeast Asia, or perhaps entrenched illiberalism in mainland Southeast Asia, question mark, as that's what's suggested by the title for the final session. Now, it may be a little bit impertinent, or odd at least, to conclude a two-day event on a topic which seems to have been taken for granted by some of our participants and not for others, with a question as to whether or not we are in fact talking about entrenched illiberalism in mainland Southeast Asia. But of course, one of the intentions of working with this title, with this category, was to think through whether or not the liberalism-illiberalism dichotomy is a useful one for considering the political and social conditions in mainland Southeast Asia today, and also perhaps escaping from that conventional relationship between authoritarianism and dictatorship, which we find in a lot of the political science and social science literature more generally. Whether or not we've succeeded in persuading anyone as to the merits of this old-fashioned dichotomy, but nevertheless perhaps useful one, is something that we'll explore in this remaining hour and a half. In order to do that, we have a marvelous panel to conclude with. We have a Professor Pasuk Phongpaichit from Chulalongkorn University, who's joining this panel after listening attentively for the last couple of days, and I'm sure she's going to have a great deal to say about what she's heard throughout this time. We have again Dr. Khin Zaw Win from the Dampa Dipa Institute in Myanmar, and from the ANU, two colleagues, both associate professors, Sango Mahanty and Bjoern Dressel. We're going to proceed in the order of the presenters as they are, in fact, in the program, with a little bit more time given to Ajahn Pasuk initially and also to Bjoern at the end to hear their views, and then some briefer comments in between from Khin Zaw Win and Sango. Now, their comments are going to range both across some of the sort of empirical questions that we've addressed in the last few days, and also topics, issues that perhaps haven't been addressed, or perhaps in their view haven't been addressed adequately, to draw our attention to those at the end. And they're also going to touch on and take up some of the conceptual, some of the methodological and some of the interpretive issues that we've been grappling with in the last couple of days. The intention here is not, I gather, unless anyone in the panel thinks otherwise, in which case they can let us know, to reach a definitive conclusion about whether or not we're dealing with entrenched illiberalism, or even whether or not it's a useful category, but nevertheless to try and take us some further steps along our inquiry, which, as for those of you who were here last night, you will already know, is part of a larger program on the rules-based order in Southeast Asia. So this will be an ongoing program out of the ANU in collaboration, I hope, with a great many of you in this room today. So that's our panel. Now, after our panel has concluded their presentations, just to let you know in advance so there's no surprises, before we get to the discussion segment, what we would like to suggest is, rather than treating this final segment as a Q&A in the manner of previous segments, we would very much welcome interventions and observations from participants from the floor along the lines of those that the panel has presented. Obviously, when making your intervention, please keep it reasonably limited. Try and stay within a good time limit. Additionally, we would like to ask that when making an intervention, you think about doing at least one of two things, if not both of them. One is retain the comparative lens. That's something we want to do very deliberately in this final session. So any interventions from the floor, we would like to encourage that they have that comparative component. And indeed, at this point, I would also say comparative not only among the three countries that we have on the table, but for those of you who are working on South Asia or maritime Southeast Asia, for any one of the Indonesianists in the room who think that you can't have a two-day event on Southeast Asia without Indonesia being mentioned at least 5 or 6 times, here is your chance to bring it into the discussion. But indeed, for colleagues working on South Asia or elsewhere also, we would very much welcome that comparative lens brought into contact with the cases we're working with. Alternatively, or in addition, approach this conceptual category and do exactly what I was suggesting already, and at least one of our speakers will touch on this, but nevertheless ask questions about the category of illiberalism, whether or not it's helpful, whether it may be a hindrance for us in understanding the political and social conditions in Southeast Asia today. If the latter, what alternative categories would you suggest and why? I could keep going on that point for some time, but I think we ought to get straight onto our panel, and so without further ado, over to Ajahn Pasuk to kick us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I have 3 points to make. These 3 societies have very powerful elites. Thailand inherited from the past without disruption of colonialization. In Myanmar and Cambodia, we have seen reconstructions of elites over the past 50 years, often adopting traditional ideas and practices. So authoritarian regimes seem very strong. However, there are 3 or 4 realities. First, the traditional peasantry, which has been the basis of all elite power, is disappearing at differing rates. But the processes are similar. Economic change via industrialization and latecomers and globalization. Second, many from these peasantries have been drawn into international labor migration and are experiencing the wider world at first hand, resulting in a comparative perspective on their own societies. And those who remain behind have access to all kinds of media and communications. And within this, we can also expect to see various women's movements at varying degree and stages in all these countries, promising to be an important part of the change to come. Third, of 3 countries, all 3 countries have experienced the communication revolution, which allows young generation learning to escape the control of learning by the older generation and old elites. So while the illiberal forces are strong, so too are the challenges. And what have been seen clearly in Thailand and perhaps elsewhere at varying degrees is that the challenges came to recognize that the elective democracy can bring about enormous change to their lives and livelihood. They also can come to understand the importance of the rule of law for constraining and stopping the old elites from exploiting and abusing their power and privileges. However, at present, in all of these countries, they are at early stage of fighting for the rule of law, even in Thailand. Thank you.
Maybe before we go to Khin Zaw Win, may I ask a sort of a follow-up prompt on the last observation on the rule of law?
Yes.
Topic in which I have a great interest. Published on it at some length. And one of the impressions I get from conversations from colleagues coming from Thailand in particular is that their argument is
Well, I think it is because actually the authority, I think, will try or has been trying to co-opt all kind of legal reform movements, but there have been quite active legal reform movement in Thailand, although we don't hear so much about them. And for example, I have been asked to speak in a few months' time to a group of lawyers about the why do I think the legal system in Thailand create inequality. They're starting to ask that question themselves. And it is interesting that they asked me to go and talk to them about why I think the legal system breeds inequality. And I'm going to talk to them about the issue of land and how the legal situation with regard to land titles and the land control in Thailand is completely illiberal and disregard the rights of the people who live on the land. And there have been various committees being set up to look at the land, at the legal reform issues. But the people who headed it tend to be very conservative, and nothing much come out of it. And I think with this new election, with several lawyers being elected in the FFP, I think we can expect to see some change. On top of that, we know that there's so many young women, young lawyers who have been working. You know, one of the things that these reformist lawyers have been able to pursue legal reform agenda so strongly because they have been so busy helping the activists that are being prosecuted by this military government. And that takes up a lot of their time. Yes.
Okay, so I think that on equality, that's something that we should have on the table for this final session and perhaps come back to it, because the term has moved around the place in many different ways. And again, I see here, one of the things I would flag is perhaps in thinking in a classical liberal mode, political and legal equality occupy one domain, and then social and economic questions of social and economic equality another. And there may or may not be adherence to social and economic equality, but nevertheless an insistence on political and legal equality. But perhaps if we can just flag that for now, and also I'm noting, of course, we have at least one of the Nitirat counterparts, I think, in the room, that we can return to the discussion on the rule of law in Thailand in due course. But I promise to keep this comparative. So let's move to Asaya Khin Zaw Win, and then if you would like to add anything on that point of the rule of law, you're welcome to do so, or move us in another direction, please.
Thank you, Nick, and it's a privilege for me to be speaking at this closing panel of what has been a very fascinating event, and I've learned a great deal being here. So the central theme, of this event about illiberalism and liberalism, I mean, Nick has mentioned whether it's really relevant to be discussed. I don't know about the other countries, but for Myanmar, let me tell you, we still haven't ended a 70-year-old civil war, and we are still a least developed country. So there is no other way but liberalism. But that's a big if also, right? So that's my view on whether we should be using liberalism. I think it's also important because for Myanmar and for many other countries, we still remain an electoral democracy. So there was so much, optimism, euphoria in 2010 and 2015 when we had elections after a long gap, and then a Democratic Party was elected. But it's nothing more than just elections. In electoral democracy, the liberal component, let me tell you, is still missing. So for what I'd like to bring up now, I'll refer to a book by an author called Nasreen Burma. The title of the book is The Peace Building Puzzle. I read the book because of, like I've said, we have this long-standing civil war, no end in sight. We don't have any, let's say, viable, tenable solutions from the Myanmar government. So when I went through the book, her point was that peace is so elusive because, number one, most of the donors, including the United Nations, have been led into thinking that certain elites can bring about peace, and so let's throw our weight behind them. But as Ajahn Pasuk has mentioned, these elites have been very, very clever in co-opting that assistance and that aid and everything that comes to it for their own ends. See? So it's a very intriguing little approach. Ms. Barma brought up 3 examples, or let's say 3 case studies. One is Cambodia after UNTAC. The second is East Timor, and the third is Afghanistan. So if you look at all 3 cases, well, of course, you know, UNTAC was the biggest UN peacekeeping operation till date, you know, and they spent billions, and look what's happened after that. You know? Of course, people were very, let's say again, euphoric when the Khmer Rouge was, you know, fell, and the elected government here in place. The same thing about Timor, what had happened to Timor after this long, you know, and brutal occupation, if I may use that word, you know, and then it became independent. And of course, Afghanistan is also a story that still continues, a very real story. And in every case, what this author pinpointed was that elites in all 3 countries had really co-opted, taken over all the assistance that coming from, you know, well-meaning donors, you know, and which was also provided very willingly, you know, and everybody thought that it would work. But in the end, what had happened was that these elites had prospered and they had persisted up to this day, and of course, it comes to an illiberal situation. So I would have thought, if I would take well, say, appendix or a footnote to what this author said, I would add Myanmar. Because, again, since 2011, after this long civil war, the peace process was started. But what we see now is, yes, the elites on both sides, you know, just don't mean the regime and the civilian government, but also the ethnic armed organizations. We have dozens of them. Well, it's like some of them call it the peace industry. So they've co-opted, you know, and received all the aid that has been provided. Australia is also quite a notable donor, but still we have no end in sight. So is this going to be just, you know, rent capture or rent seeking by these people, or they benefit greatly, but still we don't get peace? So that's what I'd like to use as my entry point. That maybe is the main point that I'd like to make, that unless we find a way, that means the people who are the citizens, you know, civil society, and also academia, you know, other political parties, and also our friends from abroad, the donors, unless we can get beyond this aid capture, I don't think we can really come to something that we can call a liberal opening, or a liberal regime, or a liberal situation where we can really say, okay, we turn the corner, you know, and we can look to a more brighter future.
And do you think that the tools, the term is not a good one, but nevertheless, it sounds a little bit instrumentalist, but the tools that are available in the liberal toolbox, as it were, some of those may in fact be used to change that condition of elite?
Yes, of course. Well, I think...
if so, what? Which one would you...
Well, all the donors was... In fact, all the donors were saying that it's something like a bank check, you know? Well, of course, in Sri Lanka, for instance, Norway had a very, let's say, hands-on role. In the end, it was not Norway that really decided Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was not a settled piece, you know. The Tamil Tigers were wiped out. So you can't say this was a military solution. It wasn't peace. So the toolbox is there, you know, and it's really something that comes to you like a bank check. You can take it, and you can put it in good use. But they use that elites in this book, and also in Emma's case, the use that they put it to was for their own ends. So they keep on, even if there are elections and if there is electoral democracy, they keep on winning election after election, remove the opposition, shut down or muzzle the press, and put restrictions on civil society. Okay, well, what can the rest of the world do? What can the West do? Or we have periodic elections, something, but then at the end, it's just these illiberal elites blowing away and keeping their footholds, and we don't really have anything that can be called a liberal situation. But to answer your question, the toolbox is there, but who and how the tools are used is really up to, let's say, let me just use the word statecraft or political skills. And you have to be a little imaginative. And you just can't wait for the UN to say that, okay, yeah, these cities get out, and we have a presto, a liberal democracy. I mean, that's the experience of the Western world. Democracy didn't emerge just like that. You really have to use elbow grease and really have to use ingenuity and put a lot of effort in it. That's what the answer I would say. It's not going to be any magic bullets or any magical solution.
Okay, I guess I've got probably 3 observations. Maybe one of them is more of a question that I'm still thinking through at the end of these very stimulating 2 days of discussion. The first point relates to, I guess, this concept of illiberalism, which isn't one that I've engaged with very much in my own research and thinking, and sort of comparing illiberalism and liberalism, both terms that have been used in the different panels that we've had, as though they kind of, there was a sense sometimes that it was about either a presence or an absence rather than relations or kind of fluidity, and even in the last panel there was discussion of how liberalism can actually help to consolidate illiberalism in the Cambodian case. So that was sort of an interesting connection between the 2 ideas. So I'm still sort of grappling with that, and I guess we've seen the terms used in slightly different ways in the last couple of days, sometimes to refer to practices, sometimes to refer to political systems or institutions. And then that takes me to my second point, which is, I guess the other observation I have is we've been looking at different scales of analysis in some of our sessions, going right through from sort of national electoral systems down to more sort of I guess in our last session on Cambodia, sort of that more granular local dynamic around, I guess, state society engagements, whether or not you sort of look at them through the lens of illiberalism. And that seems to really influence what you see in some ways. So whether, to my mind, as you get kind of closer to where people are engaging and taking action around these ideas, maybe there's a little bit more space for that hope that I think Chris was talking about yesterday, or you asked a question about where is the hope in all of this. So that's just another observation. And the third thing I think that struck me is that we're dealing with systems that are in a state of flux. And I think in pretty much all of the sessions, we've heard about sometimes cycles of change where societies are swinging from more authoritarian or illiberal to more open systems where you have kind of elections and so on. And I guess I was sort of becoming interested in that process of change, and what is it that can catalyse change in these sorts of situations. And I've made a few, I guess, broad categories that stood out to me. So there was a gradual process of change that you were talking about, changes to the peasantry, more fluidity between urban and rural environments, for example. And then I think we heard quite a few examples of sort of sudden or dramatic processes of rupture that might happen, for example, with a disaster like the cyclone in Myanmar, conflict, the coup. The other thing that I found very interesting was the generational question as a driver of change, and that's something that's struck me from the Thai situation that I think really needs to be better understood. And I guess from just reflecting from the last panel, we were very much engaging with sort of affect as a driver of kind of local action of some sort. And so that's another area that sort of interests me as a driver of change. So yeah.
On the second item on the scales of analysis, could you illustrate?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I sort of did touch briefly on this, but I can talk more to it. So I think when we're dealing at a sort of national scale, looking at regimes or political institutions, we might get a particular view of, this is my reflection, I guess, from yesterday, maybe thinking about the elections panel. You get a very systemic view of how institutions can shape the space for different groups, the space for change to occur through elections or not. And then if you go right down to the more local level, you see people engaging through very sort of personal strategies or group-based strategies to try and cope with or create change within their environment that works for them in some way, whether it's to gain recognition or to secure access to livelihood resources. So I guess that's where I'm getting at with scale. And I don't want to privilege any particular one as being more useful, because I think we need to consider all. But it just struck me that you can see different aspects of the picture depending on where you're looking. Yeah.
So that's the geographer's standpoint, and now we turn to the other side. Comparative and interdisciplinary here. So,
yeah. Thanks everyone. I think just to pick up from that, I mean, so I guess most of my work is in Southeast Asia, but I consider myself a comparativist and not necessarily a country expert, and so most of my comments now will be methodological or conceptual. And so picking up from Sango, I think my first observation is, and this is a general dilemma for conferences like this, is that we like to make broader claims about larger populations. So we are saying that democracy has a higher likelihood to be sustained, for instance, its level of income at a certain level, or there's no way of backsliding anymore after a certain threshold. But then we turn to country cases, and we often realize the country cases do not seem to follow the probabilistic patterns that we're observing in the larger population. And I think that's an important recognition, and that's where we as area studies experts often flourish, because we're positioning ourselves against the larger literature. But there's also a danger here, and I think I wanted to talk about that danger, and that is essentially that we are often drawing inferences from a very small sample. Here's 3 cases to be precise, and we're making certain claims about why these countries have ended up where they ended up. And my feeling is, and Barbara Geddes has written a famous book where she says how the cases you choose affect the answers you get, whether we have fallen in this conference a bit in this trap. So to give you a concrete example, it looks like mainland Southeast Asia is backsliding. We are facing a new wave of liberalism, if not electoral authoritarianism. But the fact is, objectively speaking, that Asia Pacific is doing relatively well. Well, the region, the world in general is backsliding. Asia Pacific actually is not necessarily backsliding on a number of indicators. And that is particularly because of the Pacific, not so much because of the Asia part. But even in Southeast Asia, we have cases like Malaysia, which are moving in a different direction. We see the Philippines and Indonesia holding on, even sometimes barely. So what I want to say here is we have to be a bit careful. And I think the justification for focusing on 3 countries would be if we are gaining conceptual leverage, which then leads me to the 3 points I want to make. The first point really is, and this is a bit, I'm still unsatisfied like Sango, that I'm not really clear out of these 2 days what we mean by illiberalism. And so in some ways, who belongs in this category? Is it a useful concept? Should we maintain it? Should we abandon it? Perhaps even worse, is it a Western concept that we are importing to a region that doesn't seem to fit into that concept? These are important questions which I think we haven't really fully tackled in these 2 days. And so what I would like to do now, very briefly, is to step back and look at an article that was written in 1997 by Farid Zakaria, a very famous article called The Rise of Illiberal Democracy, in which he essentially suggested to us, well, if we take as a starting point this ideal conception of a liberal democracy, we have really 2 dimensions to deal with. We have a liberal dimension, it's the rule of law, separation of powers, individual rights, and we have on the other hand a democracy component, which is the electoral component. And in these 2 dimensions, we can map out countries. We can say these are liberal democracies, they score high on both scores. That's an autocracy, it scores very low on both scores. And then we have these odd categories, which we call a liberal autocracy, where we have liberal rights being effective, but no elections. That might be Hong Kong. That was largely Europe for the start of the 20th century. And then we have the illiberal democracy category. Now, he reminds us in that article that historically speaking, and the historians in the room, please come in and correct me, Europe has suggested a way for us where constitutional liberalism, that is to say, the ideas around constraining arbitrary power, ultimately led to greater democracy. But we're expecting of many countries here in the illiberal campus that the democratic processes will also induce a spillover into the liberal sphere. And illiberal democracy, in essence, means they get stuck in a form where neither the democratic part works very well, nor the liberal part, but by and large, the liberal part is suffering, not the electoral. Yeah? And just to follow up on this, he suggests that 50% of the countries in 1997 fit in that category. So when you take the Freedom House Index, the civil liberties are lower than the political rights. Now, the reason I was late this morning is that I went back to the data set and I just looked at the data set again. It took me a bit of time. But in 2018, at least according to my numbers, I just took the recent data set, 14% of countries do better in the electoral domain than in the civil liberties domain. 61% have the same scores, and 23%, paradoxically, have better civil liberties scores than they have actually political rights scores. Now, I also then looked in that category in the middle, which seem to have the same scores. Where have they moved? And again, we have seen that 46% worsened, 18% stayed the same, but 34% improved. In other words, there's a lot of dynamic on both ends. And what is probably most important is that the 3 countries that we have picked, Cambodia scores better on civil liberties and political rights, believe it or not. Thailand does better on civil liberties and on political rights. And Myanmar, in some ways, has a score of 5 on each. So in other words, what I'm asking you again to consider here is, how representative are the 3 countries for the developments that we're looking at? Farid Zakaria ends this article by saying we should put our faith in the strengthening of constitutional liberalism. And I want to ask now the second question, and then I'm almost done already. What is so unique about illiberalism in Asia? And I think the point I want to make here briefly, and this is a similar bias to the one that maybe Nick has because of our work, is that I think we see a lot of activity in the constitutional space, but paradoxically, we see that this constitutional activity actually has come at the expense of a deepening of constitutional practice, and most importantly, it has been used to undermine, contain the majoritarian process of elections. And so we see entrenched interest in terms of reserve powers in Myanmar and Thailand. We see the emergence of judicial and quasi-judicial institutions in Thailand and Cambodia, which are hijacked and largely, in essence, undermining electoral processes. And we see a new layer of laws to protect the regime coalition. That is, for instance, sedition, cybercrime, lèse-majesté, and so on and so forth. My question again to all of you is, how new is that? Andreas Schädler in 2002 writes a beautiful piece called The Menu of Manipulation, in which he argued authoritarian rulers have certain strategies. And one of them is limiting civil liberties, particular media rights, entrenching reserved positions and domains, excluding, and very important, fragmenting opposition parties, which is the manipulation of the electoral rules and systems. And finally, outright electoral manipulation. We see this in Thailand when things don't go the way we wanted, or in Turkey at this point in time. So all of these mechanisms are present in our cases. All of these mechanisms have already been highlighted in the early 2000s when these debates come about. So my last point then to make is, how sustainable is illiberalism as a category? And that's, for me, really a core question. Marina Ottaway in 2003 writes an article in which she says, "Illiberal regimes engage in endless manipulations. They constantly undermine their own institutions." Levitsky, in a way, also in 2002, described illiberalism as marked by inherent tensions, contradictions, serious dilemmas, all of which, by the way, were highlighted in all of the case lines. So the camp here, that seems to be more positively inclined, is talking about the new groups, the new demands, the young voters, the new parties that form. A rural consciousness is growing in Thailand. Quite interesting, a comment by someone here saying that the institutional rules in Myanmar have also led to changes in behavior among some of the actors. So there's a message of hope coming out of the processes, out of the electoral process. But then I also want to remind you that there is a negative narrative that has emerged here. That is the demise of the liberal project in the West, which ramifications for the region. There is a new group of role models in the region, and I'm not just talking about China. I think the really interesting role model is Singapore, quite frankly. And there is essentially, as Gary Rodin would put it recently, an expansion of participation, but without growing contestation, which is often a hallmark of a liberal democratic regime. So the question then is, under what conditions do these regimes collapse, stabilize, or regress? And surprisingly, in the Journal of Democracy just from this month, a larger study which used a different data set concluded that, first of all, democracies, and even the imperfect ones, which is a large cohort, are doing and are looking much better than the weak democracies in the 1970s, so there's a positive trend here. But then the odds of survival and democratic deepening are higher when solid economic performance occurs. The odds of democratic advances are higher in wealthier countries, and the odds of breakdown are lower in more democratic neighborhoods. These are actually quite classical, traditional findings. There's nothing earth-shaking here. So let me then put three questions forward to all of us, which I think could be quite helpful. First of all, I would like to re-engage all of you on the categorization. How useful is it, as Nick just pointed it out, to think about that liberal, illiberal category? And in some ways, some of the data sets are moving away from it. Remember, VDEM now uses closed autocracies, electoral authoritarianism, someone mentioned this already today, electoral democracies versus liberal democracies, and electoral democracies is really what we're talking about. So maybe have a conversation around categorization. I also would like to ask the question, particularly to the historians who have made these arguments of mainland Southeast Asia, how different is mainland Southeast Asia from maritime Southeast Asia? And I think the geographers might have an answer for us, because it's about the centralization of power, it's about the ability to project power, and it's about maybe different trajectories, how the state formation process got interrupted and shaped historically. And I would love to hear more from all of you about it. And then finally, the question I have in my mind is, if we accept that liberal democracy is traveling quite badly to the region, what might replace then the liberal democratic model here? And I think to get an answer to that, and many of you have grappled with that when you talked about middle class behavior, a rise of conservatism, for instance, stability, I think we actually have to do a bit more homework in terms of the attitudes, in terms of the cross-fertilization between states, and then also to recognize a certain policy agility of some of these regimes to respond to shocks. Because I think the weakness of illiberal regimes and authoritarian regimes alike is that legitimacy is largely defined by stability and economic performance. And when these factors start eroding, again, going back to the large population findings, then they are in trouble. So let me leave it here and open it up to discussion.
I don't think I have anything to add. Open it up to discussion is exactly what we will do on the terms which were advertised at the start of the session. So I'll take a question from the first hand I see, and then we'll start gathering them up thereafter. Craig Reynolds, the microphone is coming.
Is it working? Yeah, this is a question really, a comment about first of Bjoern's last question. And that is about the category and liberalism, illiberalism. In some cases during the last 2 days, people got a little bit mixed up because there are too many L's in this word.
Totally.
And it's a question about translation. those countries. And why do I say that? Because I think that liberal, in my understanding, I only know one of the languages. I was once in and that's Thai. I was once in a taxi in Cambodia and heard Hun Sen speaking, and I could understand most of what he said because of all the political language that came from Cambodia and back from Thailand into Cambodia in modern times. And I don't think liberal is a term that really has much traction in the languages. I know that in Thailand it's not a big term. The other terms are more important. Independence, democracy, independence, freedom is very important in the political culture. So the question is this one of the problems with the category, that it doesn't have much traction in the languages? We only have these conversations in a Western university about liberalism and illiberalism as far as Southeast Asian language goes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to invite Khin Zaw Win to respond initially, and then Pasuk also, I think, especially. And then in the spirit of this final discussion as well, if anybody would actually like to add their own response or comment on top of what Ajahn Craig has just indicated, and we use the two-finger technique, all right? So I've got 2 fingers from Tony Reid, and I'll note any others that are responding to that point before we go on to others. Thank you. So does it need to be made before we get a response from?
It's okay, I'll be quick.
Okay.
It's a very valid point, you see. Now, I'll speak for my own country, Bahasa. I know that certain terms don't exist in, say, for Thai and also for Khmer. The same as in Bahasa, the terms like democracy, or federalism, they only use in this, let's say, the Western terms are used. We don't have anything that is in the vernacular. So if you look at, there's a big debate about federalism in Myanmar, and what we use is still federal. And I would say that liberalism is always very tricky. If you just transliterate it, it would just mean freedom. But as we know in English and other European country languages, liberalism actually means more than just freedom. You see? So you're right. Absolutely, because this is the kind of nuance that we need to get across to the public. It's not just an elite project or an elite attempt, because it'll only make things worse if you leave it to the elites. Because this is something that, yes, you could say that these were all these concepts and words, terms are just imports from the West, but this is what we have to live with. Do you want to go back to the language of monarchism? We don't want to do that. Absolutism, we don't want to do that. Even more dictatorship. So this is something that we all have to be aware of. You will have to maybe speak a little bit more to audiences, especially ordinary audiences, telling them that this is what we mean, please remember that. So it takes a little bit more efforts.
Ajahn Pasuk, would you like to add something to Ajahn Craig's?
Actually, I have been thinking about this, and at first I didn't really like the topic.
But you came anyway, so
I
thank you.
came anyway. And at first I thought this is a very, liberalism come from the Western experience. And later I went back to read about the history of it. And later I changed my mind because we are also experiencing economic change, although not exactly the same way, but in a similar way. So the process of change in thinking of the people, having gone through the economic and some political change, could happen in a similar way. And that's how I come to say, okay, I'm not going to argue against it in this meeting because I think it becomes a red herring, okay? And in fact, there's a lot of parallel experiences that happen in the West and that happen in our parts of the world, in Thailand at least. And Ajahn Craig is saying that we don't use the word liberal so much in Thailand. We don't use it for politics. We use it a lot for economic. We like economic liberalism, but we don't like, we meaning the elites, don't like political liberalism because economic liberalism is enriching the people who already have assets and property and opportunities, and that's good. But political liberalism, sharing the power with you, who used to be down there, no. And so this is, so to me, illiberal or liberal is really a question of struggling. You have to earn the liberal ideology. You can't expect a liberal values to arrive like manna from heaven. And so in this way, I don't want to argue against the organizer that used this term. And I think we have to see the struggle of each country against these powerful elites that try to maintain their political power and privileges in the own terms of each country. And I can see that each is undergoing this. And you cannot deny that they are not undergoing. But of course, there are, globalization matters in the sense that we used to, the project, the democratization project, seemed to be much easier, relatively speaking, in the post-Second World War period, because that was the time that, the global situation, the global trend is moving that way, and there was communism behind. But now, I think it become more difficult because we are surrounded by the decline of Western liberalism. Look what happened in the US. Look what happened to the the EU in relation to how they treat what's going on in Southeast Asia. I mean, self-interest comes first. And even Australia wanted to promote liberalism. But when it comes to the question of how to react to the coup in Thailand, and afterwards, the economic imperative, economic interests come first. And so what do? We have the global trend with China, Russia, and India being the leader in the region, and they're all moving towards authoritarian, one way or the other. And so I think the struggle of Southeast Asia in this context now is more problematic and more difficult, and we need any help, right, to sort of give moral support and to help promote, rather than saying that, oh, there's no hope, you're going to go towards authoritarian and this fake. I was thinking about, I was so depressed about this fake election that we are going through. And yet, it's not fake. And yet it's not, because we have seen so many changes that we could not have witnessed without this election, because of the last 5 years of nobody being able to speak or to express anything. At least the electoral process is part of the struggle. And maybe this time the pro-liberal or the pro-democracy may not win. But then, tomorrow is another day.
Thank you. I will keep working towards the optimistic conclusion in these 2 days. Pasuk, you've moved us on some distance from Dan Craig's question, but with those 2 fingers, Tony, did you still want to follow up on that point? And I saw Christoph as well, and if anyone else wants to sort of grab hold of that preliminary point, please do so now.
The point being the appropriateness of illiberalism, I think. In that case, yes, I suppose 2 things. And I'll try not to mention Indonesia despite your provocation. It does seem to me it's an unfortunate term. I'm on the side of Craig there, partly because it has such, illiberalism is negative. That's already a problem, but it prioritizes liberalism as something desirable on the other hand. And that doesn't fly very well, of course, with neo-Marxists, with Muslims, for all I know, with conservative Buddhists and others who oppose what they see as social experiments in the West, which are not to their taste, and nor with the people who regret the way in which economic liberalism has delivered great inequality. So, I mean, all those things are negatives about liberalism that make it seem to me not what you want to be pursuing. It seems to me it's more important to look for new terms, new positive terms for what is happening. And I mean, what is happening is clearly a number of ways of avoiding imitating a Western path, avoiding what are seen as the disruptive consequences of introducing a notion of poverty of condition once we've executed all kings and we've dropped the idea of heavenly mandates. It is a destabilizing situation. So we have a kind of fascism, and we don't use that term, but in a way, if we perhaps replace it with organicism, it's a valid historical category of ways in which rulers try to express the need for kind of an organic unity in society. We have a return of monarchic ideas, very clear in Malaysia, Brunei, but also, of course, what's happening in Thailand. We have nationalism and autarky and the kinds of things that were all in, sorry, I mentioned it. And should we not be devoting our attention rather to these typologies than suggesting there's a kind of a black-white dichotomous thing here about liberalism, which in itself deifies liberalism.
Thank you. I think Christoph also wanted to pick up on this point, and if anyone else has a sense of urgency to do so, please indicate.
I want to pick up on the point of hope. Like, I was thinking, why have you guys organized this conference? I think the underlying sense is that something has changed. I think that is like probably the feeling that was in the room. Now, Bjoern hopefully running back to the indicators and check them all up and says, well, nothing really fundamentally has changed, or at least not something out of the ordinary or what we would expect. Okay, now, let's check the blurb again. What is it what they had in mind here? And the blurb says, what happened to the promise of liberal democracy, and what can be done to restore that promise? Is it, maybe it has a promise? Is that the thing that has really changed?
Thank you. I'm going to get out of this by referring to, as you mentioned him, by referring to Bjoern to respond to your remarks on his intervention. And Sango also, if you would like to tip in on this question of whether or not the category is useful. I know you did remark on it briefly.
Yeah, I mean, this is now tough because, I mean, already all the speakers who responded have used different concepts, different conceptualizations. And I think it's just a reminder for us that concepts are mental placeholders for phenomena that we are observing, ontologically speaking. Yeah? And in some ways, we are hoping that we get it somewhat right and that my neighbor will understand what I mean when I describe it. I personally, but maybe here comes the bias as a political scientist, I think it is still a very useful category. And it is a useful category precisely because of what I described. It's a liberal democracy. It tells us something about that there's something going on in the rights space, and there might be going something on in the electoral space. And I think we need to understand these dynamics, and we need to be able to create a classification system for us where countries belong, where countries move, and what are the potential drivers for moving from one category to the other. I want to link it to one more comment on the previous question, because what I often get back from country experts is precisely that. There are language nuances, the vernacular doesn't translate very well, people don't really know what liberalism is, and so on. And I always wanted to remind all of us, because I've tried to do that exercise in Thailand with the rule of law. I'm not particularly fluent in Thai at all, so I needed a lot of help. But the point is, the concepts are there, they're getting picked up, there's a certain degree of isomorphism and mimicry when the elites adopt these terms. And in some ways, what is really the important part is how different actors contest the notions that are read into these kind of concepts. And that's actually the interesting battle, right? I mean, it's about, you can have a different understanding in Thailand, but that understanding is also contested within Thailand. And so what I'm really interested in is not to say this concept travels or doesn't travel, but what I want to know is who makes it travel, who contests it, what kind of meaning are we reading into it? And I think Sango is on the spot. That question often depends also on what level are we looking at. So people might not really understand what liberalism is in an abstract sense, but they certainly know what the infringement on rights is at a local level and what it means to their lives, right? And so I think we have to be very careful at what level are we operating when we're making these claims. And I think most importantly, I would always advance the notion that, as Ajahn Pasuk said, it's about contestation, it's about different interests clashing, and I think that's what our job as social scientists is, to understand that struggle for meaning. And that's the same that happened in Europe and unfolded in a particular way. And I hope that in 50, 60, 80 years, we're not looking back and saying liberal democracy in Europe and the US, for instance, was a little blip in history. But actually, we're moving back to an old equilibrium that looked very different.
Yeah, I don't know if we need to kind of resolve whether or not, we should all go away and use this concept or not, because I guess people will find, as Bjoern has, we kind of have a little fan club going. As Bjoern has said, I think, if it's useful to describe certain phenomena, then, by all means, use it. I think, to me, though, actually, what I found really useful was this idea of struggle, and that whatever it is that we're talking about in terms of the change processes aren't coming easily, and that there are interests at stake here. And I think I found that a very useful way of thinking about some of the contests that have been documented over these couple of days. So I just wanted to draw attention back to that.
Thank you. Let's take things in another direction. I can see Greg has his hand up. I saw Melissa first. So we'll take a question from Melissa first. We'll come to Greg after that. We do have a few questions still on the table from Bjoern. I know, Melissa, you're well positioned to talk both about maritime and mainland Southeast Asia. So if there's some way to weave that into your question, then by all means do so.
Sure. So thanks to the panel. I wanted to respond also to Bjoern and perhaps suggest a way of reframing or thinking about it from perhaps a slightly different perspective. I think for me, the value of the last 2 days is in part, this was an intentionally interdisciplinary conversation, and so it's inevitable that different disciplines, I think, often bring concepts that may have different terms or different concepts entirely, and so part of the dialogue is about figuring out what we mean and where the common ground between them. So on one hand, I appreciate Farid Zakaria's piece on constitutional liberalism, but for me, from more of a legal discipline, that we usually use the terms the other way around. So we talk about liberal constitutionalism or illiberal constitutionalism rather than constitutional liberalism and so on. So you can kind of see that I think there's a value in a dialogue because in legal scholarship more recently, people like Phongpaichit, Leanne Theo talk a lot about illiberal constitutionalism. I think there are some similarities, but yeah, for me there's value in dialogue rather than simply falling back on quantitative political science data as a trump for the kind of terms that we're talking about. And so I would just say three kind of very broad observations about the last few days. One, I think, is that there are variations and diversity in forms of illiberalism. The second is that there's a sense of the stickiness of illiberalism, that it's something that's kind of hard to get rid of, and I think that's kind of indicated in this title of Entrenched Illiberalism. And then third, perhaps, that it's harder to move away from illiberalism than it is towards it.
Can you clarify the last point?
I guess, so the point was that it's harder to move away from illiberalism than it is towards it. And I simply took part of the emphasis of the conference to be a concern that when countries are perceived to be turning to illiberalism, that there is perhaps then a long haul back to illiberalism or perhaps building liberalism new.
Thank you. Anyone like to, from the panel, pick up on the last point? There was maybe a bit of disciplinary pushback for you there, Bjoern, if you wanted to touch on that. It's always good to be reminded there's a lawyer in the room. And then if any other colleagues would like to jump in on anything.
Yeah,
and again, the two-finger rule
I mean, just very quickly, I mean, Sango was laughing when, another turning around, it's illiberal constitutionalism, and we're all good of creating these new categories, but I think what Melissa is expressing and what the legal community is expressing, and I think I went through this very quickly, is that there might be something distinctly unique playing out here, and that is that the law in constitutional practice is used as a tool in that process to a degree that it has never been used before. And so, when you think about it, I mean, constitutionalism is generally perceived as the protection of individual rights. It's about the arbitrariness of power. Melissa is also right sometimes of reminding us that it's about constituting as much as it is constraining. But the point is, we see a hyper-engagement in these areas all around Asia, right? I mean, like everyone who would draft a new constitution. And constitutions are quite sticky, unfortunately, because they require some supermajority rules often to change, but people are permanently engaged in them. In Thailand, we still dream about 97. In other countries, we want to draft a new one. But the point is, why that effort in the legal sphere of entrenching sometimes positions that are anti-majoritarian? And as you know, I work mainly on the judiciary, and of course the judiciary has become a central focal point of these activities. Judiciaries are meant to protect the constitution, but the reality is, in a clientelist system of Southeast Asia, courts are often co-opted, courts are often instrumentalized, and I think they come quite close to this kind of idea of juristocracy, where a group is empowered precisely to counteract majoritarian processes that the elites do not think they can control anymore. And so we have these permanent paradoxes where you can run an election in Thailand, but you eliminate some candidates right away, and even if they make it through the last round, you still come up with some fishy cases from 2015 to change or rebalance. And it looks good on paper because formal judges have been involved in this process, but we all know that behind the curtains something else is going on. So the really interesting question I have actually for the PhD students here in the room is Melissa really right that it's easier to slide into illiberalism? Or is it really like a slope that you can barely control? Once you get to illiberalism, authoritarianism is waiting already. You can barely control it. I think the reality is you can actually stick around for quite some time in that gray zone space, right? And in fact, from the data I've just very quickly this morning, and please don't rely on that statement, I think there's probably a 50-50 chance that it goes the other way as well, right? So I would love someone to pick it up and really test it a bit more broadly, because it's a tempting proposition. But is it true?
PhD students in the room are on notice that they're going to need to respond to that at some point. But Jan Pasuk, first of all, I would like to add something.
I just want to say that the reality in each country may be quite different from what you think. And I think that in each of these countries we are talking about, the idea of liberalism or illiberalism are also being debated. You know, they may not, I mean, a lot of people may not be familiar with these kind of terms, but, you know, the sense of individual versus the collective are still being debated in all these countries, including Thailand. And the way the constitution, whether we're moving towards constitutional illiberalism or whatever, it kind of reflects the flux in each country, right? So you have to allow things to work itself out, and it may take a lot of time. Another thing that I want to say is that I have noticed that two countries in Asia that, maybe three, but maybe India is so special on its own. You have Japan and Korea, that two Asian countries that become a democracy and stick to it. And what are special about these two countries? Of course, they went through real industrialization in similar way that the West went through. But none of the other Asian countries have gone through that. And so we are kind of in a limbo, you know, the economic transformation was not complete. And of course we can't be complete because we are in a different stage of the globalization or whatever. And, you know, you can't think of how Thailand could become like Korea or become like Japan. It's a different period altogether. And so as we are in a limbo economically, we are also in a limbo in other ways, politically, value-wise, societal-wise, political, you know, context. We are trying to work out ourselves, where are we, and what kind of society we would like to be, you know. So, and it is in this context then, the attempt to try to apply the Western term, which have gone through with thinkers that have track of treaties on liberalism, you go back to the 16th century. And how long did it take the West to come to terms with full democracy as it had been, and how now it's going through a decline? And we are just a wee baby, right, in this context. So I'm saying this to remind us that it's always problematic when you try to apply the kind of terms that apply so well for some countries that went through a certain kind of economic and social and political transformation to some other countries that have not and are going through, and maybe they are moving in a different directions. Who knows? And I am prepared to wait and see where we're moving to, where Myanmar is moving to, where Cambodia is moving to. And it doesn't have to be, I would like it to be like England, because I'm brought up in Australia. I'm brought up in England, you know, in my educational years. And I appreciate these Western values of democracy, of your self-assertion, yourself can determine things and not relying on whatever. But then you can expect the role of the society and the role of the state to come in, you know, where individual cannot pursue. And this has come because of my experience, and I would like Thailand to be like that. But I have to admit that if I had that kind of wish, I would have to be depressed every day, right? So I have to save myself by having the history to inform me. Anyway, this is just to inform you that don't expect us to be going linear. We may go like this for some time, but we are hoping we are getting somewhere.
Let's, thinking about linearity and time, we are starting to get a bit short, so we'll take Greg and then Paul together, and then I have noted Narumon, Prajak and Nyatet for the next round of questions, and we'll see how we go after that. Or comments?
This is just a kind of response to Bjoern in terms of why is mainland Southeast Asia an analytically worthwhile group, I think. And this sort of comes out, I think to do that you need to kind of think about international interactions, cross-border interactions, which we haven't talked about very much over the last 2 days. It's funny, most of the time I spend my time with IR scholars and convincing that domestic politics is important is quite a task. But you know, here it's a different kind of discussion where I think we need to talk about perhaps international influence. And there's an interesting paper that came out in 2016 by Marianne Muir and Thomas Demelbuller, and they call it Gravity Centres of Authoritarian Rule. And it's the idea that geography matters in terms of authoritarian influence. And they say that, you know, just in the same way that with gravity as a physical force, proximity matters, so does authoritarian influence matter, vary according to geographic proximity. And they say that, they argue that you can have authoritarian gravity centres, such as DRC, influencing dependent on, because of the quantity of interactions, the existence of networks, and the similarities of outlook. And I think with some of the countries in mainland Southeast Asia and China, you can start to see that. Certainly with the quantity of interactions, there's a lot of now regional groupings, a lot of sub-regional organisations in mainland Southeast Asia. We're seeing more of them now. The Lanchar Mekong is the latest one, but of course the Greater Mekong sub-region and ACMES, and there's others, where the leaders are meeting on a regular basis. So I think we can argue that existence of networks in the commercial world, if you look at the Sino-Thai relationships between companies like Bjoern and their relations with the Chinese mainland, they've been able to build those investment links because of family linkages back to those provinces, and that's been quite important for Thailand's trade relationship with China. But the militaries in the region also have quite close networks. For example, the commander of the Myanmar armed forces, he apparently is very close to the
Thai.
Privy Councillor Fred Long. Hunmanet has close linkages with the Thai military. So there are these linkages. And then in terms of similarity of outlook, one discourse that you'll find common across these countries is that colonialism was bad. It was, you know, we're being forced down a Western track. We shouldn't necessarily respond to the West. And that becomes a similarity of outlook that you'll find between Hun Sen and Brigitte at times, and probably across Myanmar as well. So I would put that as some reasons to think about why this group might be useful analytically.
Thanks, Greg. Can we just get Paul in here as well?
First of all, a question for you, Bjoern. Those were really great comments. I just wish that they had come earlier because I thought they were very good for framing things. But when you speak of problems of case selection, is it really a problem of case selection, or rather to ensure that when you discuss cases, you do so within a context of a clear comparative framework, whether it's Zachariah or going back further, Diamond, Lins and Lipset, or the VDEM categories you alluded to, or pulling something from the legal profession, whatever that might be. And so is the problem case selection, or just ensuring that you have the proper framework for doing that? And also, to pick up on Greg's point, to make sure that you combine it with clear analysis of regional and global trends, so that you know the kinds of analysis that Zachariah did in 1997 clearly need to be updated into a new environment, even if you chose to stick with the same 2x2 matrix. That's a question for you. And
who are uncomfortable with the term illiberalism, I'm wondering whether there might be a greater degree of comfort if we're speaking of infringements on rights or infringements on civil and political liberties. So is it a discomfort with the term in the abstract when maybe there may be a higher comfort level if we're speaking more specifically of right to a fair trial, freedom against arbitrary arrest, freedom against arbitrary expulsion or expropriation, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. Regardless of whether there's a word for all of these things in the three relevant languages, when it comes just to freedom of assembly, we know in Thai history there's been great anger when people have assembled and they've been mowed down, whether 1973, 76, 92, 2010, 11. I mean, if we move away from the big category of liberalism to break this down, is there a higher comfort level? Thank you.
Thanks. So, entrenched impunity or entrenched injustice in mainland Southeast Asia as an alternative title for the next time we run this program. And a couple of particular questions for Bjoern, and then also, I suppose, for the other panelists coming out of Greg's observations. Have we overlooked regional networks and arrangements, both institutional and ideational, in our discussions? We'll start with Bjoern and then maybe go to, say, Khin Zaw Win after that and come back to this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I need to answer. I mean, these are tough questions, and I feel like I'm back in my methods class, which I'm normally teaching. But, well, of course, Paul, I mean, we all use theoretical frameworks and we use cases to illustrate it. But really, to give you now a very standardized answer, I think what case studies do is they try to explain particular outcomes in that case. So they are sometimes quite deterministic, right? Whereas when I present large data, what I'm trying to do is I'm telling you probabilistic stories. These are probability raisers, right? And I think in some ways what we are trying to do here, and that was my concern, I was wondering, because the assumption is what we observe at the case level should also hold at the population level. But that becomes a real problem if the cases that we selected might be outlier cases of a certain degree. Yeah? And I think that maybe I misread a bit the conference, but I felt like by selecting these countries, which there are good reasons for, because we don't want to compare to Laos and Vietnam, but there might be a bit of a tendency to see a trend emerging that maybe doesn't hold in the larger population in the region, but certainly not globally, right? And I think that's what I was pushing back. But I also appreciate your point of saying, hold on a minute, and Greg made that point too, there's something really going on that's worthwhile investigating. I'm certainly not standing in the way. And maybe the answer for that is to move to a different level of abstraction here to make the conversation happen.
Thank you. Khin Zaw Win.
All right, yeah. About the geographic proximity, after the end of the Cold War, well, kind of borders were really fixed and sacrosanct, but now they've become more vague, let's say porous. The Indian Prime Minister was saying that we don't have to be just bothered too much by fixed borders, and we know what he's getting at. It was closer relations with ASEAN, and using Myanmar as a conduit and all that. Now, the big concept for all of us is China's Belt and Road. Just last week I was in Sichuan, and this is a Lanshan Mekong education event. I was really stunned. It's a place that 2 weeks ago I hadn't heard of. It's a place called Yibin. It's in southeastern Sichuan, and that's going to be the education hub for Lanshan Mekong. Lanshan Mekong, it looks so attractive, but in a way it brings the 6 countries much closer together. The Thais had a large delegation led by a very senior former Deputy Prime Minister, I forget his name. The Laotians had a former Deputy Prime Minister. Myanmar sent a very small delegation. I just happened to be there. But the sense is that, at least on education, we have all the other things too: connectivity, infrastructure, finance. The 6 countries are coming together. And that includes the 3 countries we're talking about. So it matters a lot, especially because of China and what China is trying to push. Okay. And let me just add what Bjoern and Melissa have said. I'm very much taken by the 2 disciplines, political science and law. But I'd also like to add that these things don't have to be deterministic. I happen to be speaking in an academic setting, but yesterday there was a launching of supporting the rules-based order in Southeast Asia, and that's a collaboration between ANU and DFAT. And if I were to speak on the behalf of, let's say, the foreign ministry, DFAT, if you really interact with those 6 countries, you can't, well, it's wonderful to have an event like this academic, but you can't talk to the policymakers. Let me just make myself, using this example, going to them with a sheaf of academic papers saying that this is what you need to do. They will say, we don't have the time. Please tell us what to do. And what I want to drive on is the human dimension. The human dimension means the dimension of leadership. We all, in this kind of setting, we know what needs to be done, but the policymakers may not. So maybe I'm very much supportive of this project with DFAT, but that's one thing that Australia needs to do. China's doing it. So in a way, I see that this rules-based order could be a balance to what China's trying to do. China's talking about a community of common destiny. That's one step beyond Belt and Road. So that's something that I think we should all think about.
Thank you. Great. Would Sango?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Paul's point about would there be a higher comfort level with those more positive framings that you had? And I think there would be, because I think the whole notion of illiberalism suggests this opposite, that is somehow aspirational but unspecified, and could include all these kind of processes that we've observed have negative implications on the ground and so on. But I also get that you can't capture all that neatly in one term easily. Yeah, but I think that specificity is quite important. Yeah.
Pasuk, did you have any very brief comments? No? Okay, we are hard up against the clock, so what we're going to do is treat perhaps this last round of comments and observations as comments and observations. If there's a question in them, then perhaps they continue into informal gatherings in the evening. We might start with Myatet and then come back to Ajahn Narawan and then Prachak as well. Thank you.
Enlightened Dharma Research Foundation. Before I ask questions to the panelists, I first would like to express my sincere appreciation for organizing this conference, raising questions on entrenched illiberalism in Southeast Asia. Despite that, the term illiberalism or liberalism is the subject of academic debates, and I understand how it is important of this debates in terms of the academic discipline, because when I learn about the topics of the subject, I also remember my times in my studies in international relations relating to the terms like neoliberalism, liberalism, realism, structuralism. I mean, you name it, endless interdisciplinary terms. But what I would like to say is we should not be trapped in this debate in order to have a practical impact on the change in the society. And I think in order to have a practical change in the society, for this kind of conference is very important. What I think is, I would like to also mention that what I got from these 2 days of the conference regarding on the understanding of illiberalism as per the presentations, discussions, discussions of everyone involved in this conference, I understand in liberalism they understand, and the illiberalism they want to eliminate, they want to fight is the one which is I think the ism which the illiberalism they really want to fight is the ism which only see the interest of we should work to have more all-inclusive, all-inclusiveness, all-inclusive isms for all, for the well-beings of human beings
Thank
on
you.
Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nat. Great closing statement. I'm not sure that our Thai colleagues can trump that, but try your best. But again, with an awareness of the crop. Thank you.
I think I follow with pauses. I think when we use the word liberal and illiberalism, and also back to the issue whether these three countries can be the case study to answer comparatively. But I think if we change the term, for instance, with the word demonopolization, this is take place in three countries. Is monopolizing in terms of the power that might call illiberal for those who are in the elite. And if you look at the economy, I think the reason that we debate about liberal and illiberal is also related to the issue of everyday life for the economy of the people. I mean, for those who might claim for China, one thing that we have to accept for Singapore is that this issue of illiberal or liberalism is separately in terms of the for the issue of the economy. But in case of these three countries, you will see the process of monopolization of the power and the issue of the inequality and discrimination. So it's quite clear for these three countries. So it's monopolization of power and social hierarchy and economic inequality. Whether we will use the term that whether the word liberalism will solve this kind of process, that might be useful. And if not, we might go to a different term. I think it's fine. The other thing I think is if we do comparatively. For me, these three countries, in some way, I still maybe am still optimistic comparing with Ajahn Pasuk, more optimistic than Ajahn. I still believe in a certain seed. I mean, even though I'm really pessimistic for Thai civil society, but even so, I still find some hope. And it's the same thing with Myanmar, even though we talk about the Rohingya or Cambodia with the issue on a certain level. But I think maybe if we try to use the word, we will talk about how the process of liberalization, in that case, how it's, maybe we might have to bring back political economy, bring economic sphere back to the political sphere, because otherwise if we separate between the two spheres, we are really going to end up very depressed.
Thank you. We'll see if Pajak will help us also to conclude on an optimistic note or otherwise. All right. Please remove the mic from him.
My colleague from Myanmar said many things that I want to say. I just have two small points. I think to defend you too, to help you defend the topic. I think that's valid concern to talk about illiberalism, illiberal trend in the region when you look at not obsessed with the abstract idea, but when you look at the way that state leaders
very much. Well, at this point, I would like to thank everyone very much for the active participation in this last session. I think it's been tremendously nourishing. We could exhaust ourselves, I'm sure, with another few days of this discussion, but that's all the time and funding that's been allocated for this activity. Before we close, and again, offer thanks for that time and the allocation of funding, can I ask everyone also to especially thank our panelists